We are proud members of the Spy Podcast Network. Find out more at www.spypodcasts.com.
Due to the themes of this podcast, listener discretion is advised.
Pretty much every genocide of the 20th century, one of the things we saw was neighbors turning on neighbors. So Yazidis feel immense distrust towards the local kind of tribes and families that live around the region.
Lock your doors, close the blinds, change your passwords. This is Secrets and Spies. Secrets and Spies is a podcast that dives into the world of espionage, terrorism, geopolitics, and intrigue. This podcast is produced and hosted by Chris Carr.
On today's podcast, I'm joined by Liam Duffy, who works for the Counter Extremism Project, and we take a look at his research on Western foreign fighters and the Yazidi Genocide. This conversation was recorded last year, so there may be a few points that feel a little dated, and some points that may feel a little prescient. Just before we begin, a few things. First of all, we now have a website for the podcast. It's secretsandspies.com, so please go and check it out. One of the cool features of the website is that it highlights all your reviews. So I've been saying for a while now, please, if you want to support this podcast, please leave a review. So the algorithms of your podcast app really like reviews, and so it helps people find this podcast. So your review, not only can it help people find the podcast, but now you can actually read it on the website on the review page. So thank you very much for everybody who has left a review. There's been some very kind ones, and there's been a few unkind ones as well. But I appreciate that everybody's taking a chance to actually engage with the podcast and leave a review, so thank you very much. If you also want to support the show, please consider becoming a Patreon subscriber. For £3 a month, you can become a friend of the podcast, and I will now send you a pack of 4 Secrets and Spies branded coasters. So if you need something for your glass of scotch, or for your martini, or for your coffee, then these Secrets and Spies coasters are for you. If you don't wish to become a subscriber, that's absolutely fine. You can go to our Redbubble store and you can get branded coasters, cups, tote bags, and even water bottles. So please do check that out. Any purchase obviously goes towards helping the podcast. And lastly, don't forget to watch my film The Dry Cleaner. It's available on Apple TV and Amazon Prime. I think it's about £2, which is about $2-3. It was my first attempt at spy fiction, and I hope it's not my last attempt at spy fiction. I am planning on other projects at the moment, feature films and TV shows, so watch this space, and hopefully in the not too distant future there might be some very cool news about that. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this show, and I appreciate all your support. Take care.
The opinions expressed by guests on Secrets and Spies do not necessarily represent those of the producers and sponsors of this podcast.
Liam, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Great to have you on. Can you just tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure, yeah. The most obvious place I should probably start is, so I do a lot of work for the Counter Extremism Project, which is New York-based.
Yeah.
They've got offices in Berlin, in Brussels, and now in London as well. So I'm a strategic advisor for them with Ian Aitchison, I think you might know of. He's former prison governor and led a government review on extremism. So he and I are kind of the London representation for the Counter Extremism Project. But I'm also... I never like to use this word because it sounds a bit, I don't know, it sounds a bit over the top and a bit cooler than it is, but I guess I'm a consultant as well. So I do different projects, sometimes around the world if I can do. So, and before COVID hit, I was working on a training project in East Africa for civil society leaders, trying to get to grips with kind of Al-Shabaab recruitment and radicalization. So I'm sure your listeners will know Al-Shabaab is the Al-Qaeda linked franchise in East Africa. So that kind of thing, lots of training, lots of research, anything I can poke my nose in and make some trouble in. basically.
So, Liam, you've released this fascinating and horrifying report titled Western Foreign Fighters and the Yazidi Genocide, and you released that through the Counter Extremism Project. Can you just tell us a little bit more about what the Counter Extremism Project is?
Sure, yeah. So I mean, the organization calls itself an international policy organization, but I guess to the lay audience, that means it's a think tank. As cringe as it sounds, a think and a do tank, I guess, because we do training and different, like, actual kind of delivery of projects through governments in Europe, and we've worked on projects in Africa as well, and in the Balkans and places like that. So kind of like building capacity for local actors on the ground. But I think mainly it is a think tank. So produce a lot of research on various forms of extremism. There's a big focus from the organization on combating terrorist content online. So that's always something that is right at the top of the agenda for the organization. But other than that, I think it's, they've a lot of work done on the far right, a little bit on far left, and we're trying to do a bit more on that actually imminently. And a lot on, well, my focus is on Islamist groups and jihadist groups. So I don't know too much about the other groups that fall under the other umbrellas, but yeah, so all sorts, anything that's extremism or counterterrorism related, you can probably bet that we've had some sort of say on it or done some sort of research on it.
Yeah, fantastic. So you start your report with this absolutely horrific story about this poor 5-year-old Yazidi girl who is chained outside in the scorching heat. And she's been chained outside because she was ill and wet her bed. And her mother is also chained with her and ends up having to watch her daughter die. And this sort of horrific behaviour, sadly, is not uncommon when it regards to ISIS and the Yazidis. Can you please talk to us a little bit about what the Yazidis went through at the hands of ISIS?
Yeah, sure. I mean, as you said, it's horrifying and harrowing. So maybe just for the benefit of listeners who maybe aren't familiar, apart from kind of the headlines that I'm sure most people remember from around 2014. So the Yazidis are a really small religious minority in the Middle East. They've got a population around Sinjar in Iraq, but there's Yazidis in Syria, in Iran, in Turkey as well, in Armenia. So there's small kind of pockets of communities here and there. So they, for a long time, they have they've been kind of marginalized. They don't have the same in Iraq. They haven't had the same kind of educational opportunities. They haven't had the same kind of state funding into local infrastructure. So really kind of deprived and marginalized community. And I mean, Yazidis count themselves, I think having suffered over 70 attempts to wipe them off the face of the planet in their history, according to their own kind of historical records. So what ISIS did to them in a way wasn't new. It was another attempt to destroy Yazidism and Yazidi people. So what happened with ISIS was, so obviously everybody remember that awful summer of 2014, when I think June 2014 was the Caliphate Declaration, wasn't it? And then around that time you had the videos of the Western hostages, starting with James Foley getting beheaded on the internet. And it was just, I mean, I'm sure you remember just how horrific that period was. It was just deeply unsettling. Then you kind of thought that, how much more depraved can it get? And true to ISIS style, it got more depraved with what they did with the Yazidis a couple of months later in August of 2014. So yeah, like I said, I mean, this is a kind of vulnerable, marginalized, small community in Iraq, and ISIS kind of descended on them around Sinjar. And I mean, we can get more into the details, well, not very nice detail, albeit, but they kind of descended on defenseless community. Every man and every woman who they kind of deemed wasn't fit for sexual enslavement was executed on the spot, thrown into mass graves that are still being discovered to this day. And then women and children were rounded up and kidnapped and trafficked and enslaved through ISIS territory, which I'm sure you remember was kind of covering an area bigger than Great Britain at the time, across Iraq and Syria. So That's the kind of brief overview, but we can definitely get into more of what actually went on.
Don't feel you have to hold back. This particular podcast is focused to adults, and I just really want to get a true picture of the true horrific nature of ISIS.
Yeah, okay. I don't want to really say this because it sounds self-indulgent, but I mean, the whole time I was doing the research, and this isn't kind of stealing valor of trauma or anything. That's far from what I'm doing, but there was just kind of I just kind of had a deeply unsettled and uneasy feeling the entire time I was doing the research, because it was just some of the details that you read, the kind of survivor accounts, and even what people who joined the group were saying themselves. They were openly talking about what they were doing to Yazidis on social media, and in their own kind of Islamic State's official propaganda. And it's just, you're reading these things and you just kind of have to pinch yourself and remind yourself, well, this really happened to other human beings. And there's this kind of idea that genocide is this thing that happened in the history books, or we kind of live in this more enlightened age, I guess, or it's something that happens to faraway people that we don't really understand or know much about. So maybe like happened in Rwanda and places like that. But I think one thing I really wanted to get across in this report is that actually large numbers of our own citizens were involved in the atrocities against Yazidis. So I think that was really what, you've read it, as I said in it, it's not a kind of deep, in-depth academic study. It's just really to nudge the needle of debate and a reminder that our own citizens kind of have blood on their hands for what they did to Yazidis. And not only that, but in a lot of cases they were boasting about it as well, kind of openly bragging about raping Yazidi women, indoctrinating Yazidi children. And it wasn't just, we're not just talking about men here. It was women were posting about this on social media as well who joined ISIS. So it's just the most kind of just barbarism on an unimaginable scale and depth. But people who, went to our universities or worked in our offices, or people who grew up trying to want to be a rapper in Nice or Paris, ordinary people. We think of ourselves from this more enlightened society where these things would never happen, but ordinary people from our own societies did go and take part in this kind of bottomless inhumanity, and that's something I think we're in danger of forgetting, or is it at least in danger of being written out of the kind of historical consciousness on this, for a few different reasons, which again we can explore.
We'll definitely talk about that in a little bit, because there is definitely, I think, I don't know, when it comes to debates around ISIS, there are some people who have the opinion that it's somehow racist to talk about ISIS. And I just find that attitude very strange. I even remember when I was trying to make my film, The Dry Cleaner, once somebody asked me if it was racist to make a film about Islamic extremism, and I was just like, it's an interesting question, that one. And I think it blocks people from properly discussing some of the things that need to be discussed.
Oh, without doubt. Yeah, I think that's a huge problem, and it's really prevalent, and it kind of, I mean, I think there are some nefarious actors who do that. Kind of, obviously there are the out and out jihadi groups, but there are also Islamist groups that operate in the West as well, which are not jihadist groups, but they specialize in kind of muddying the water around these topics and making it difficult for people to talk about through racism and Islamophobia accusations. But I think the broader problem is a kind of, I call it. Have you heard the term othering before?
Yes.
Yeah. So I think there's kind of an inverse, like, liberal othering here going on. So it's like we kind of don't want to or can't hold our own citizens to the same legal and moral standards, because and it's not even in every case, but often case they're perceived to be from a marginalized minority community, and it's actually like, well, no, if we view people as equal citizens before the law and hold them to the same moral standard, we can escape that attitude. And I think I've kind of used the expression on just specifically on the Yazidi genocide. It's kind of a wrong for the Yazidis. It's really unfortunate because they're the wrong type of victim and it's the wrong type of perpetrator. Because what you said is absolutely right. We find it a lot easier to talk about other forms of extremism in some cases. But there is this kind of awkward, uncomfortable air around talking about Islamist or jihadist extremism, which is really unproductive. And actually, I think one of the worst things about it has been that in a lot of Western countries, the far right has been able to capitalize on that.
Oh yeah, definitely. They take control of that narrative, don't they? Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. So there's this whole thing. I mean, one of the I kind of snuck this line into an article that I hope I have coming out soon. But there's the whole. I mean, I'm sure everybody who listens to this will be more than familiar with George Orwell. But I mean, he's so kind of unanimously revered that in one sense he is every kind of political faction across the spectrum kind of tries to claim him. But there is also on the left, especially in the late 20th century, there was kind of his name was kind of still mud a little bit, and the reason for that was the assertion that he had in inverted commas given ammunition to the enemy. So even though he was a fierce opponent of colonialism and fascism, he'd also been a tenacious critic of Stalinism and Soviet communism, and that was kind of an unforgivable sin for some people on the left, that he had made it easier for the right or the establishment to criticize kind of leftist ideas. So I think you see a really similar dynamic over Islamist extremism. Is like people don't want to talk about it because they're afraid of giving ammunition to the right. But actually, what I think by not talking about it, you give more ammunition to the far right than you ever would by talking about it. Because like you said, it allows them to snatch the narrative and say, these people don't care about these kind of atrocities that are happening. They don't care about, people getting killed by terror attacks. And they just don't want to talk about this problem in a frank and open way. So yeah, that just opens this kind of void and vacuum for the far right to fill. So yeah, I think by the sounds of it, we're on the same page on that one.
Yeah, no, I think so. And it's been a concern of mine for years, to be honest, because, one of my motivations, I suppose, out of interest is, like many people, I personally would not want to be a victim of terrorism. The last thing I'd want is to kind of get blown up or stabbed or whatever going out somewhere. And it's, it's a public safety concern, ultimately, whether it be presented by Islamic extremists, far right extremists. We might have the return of the IRA with what's going on in Ireland at the moment, or it could be, I don't know, some sort of Baader-Meinhof type far leftist extremists, or even environmental extremists, because I have a pet feeling that's going to be definitely something in the future we're going to see.
No, but I think you're right to bring it from. I think we can get lost in talking about abstracts a little bit and trying to endlessly pursue kind of nuance in our judgment of this. But actually, for a lot of people, don't see it like that and don't want to see it like that. And yeah, the threat of terrorism is small, of course it is, but the fear is very real. And what happens to people is, you could see, Samuel Paty's murder in France in October 2020. I mean, that was one death, but kind of the nature of it and the issues that it invoked and the gruesome kind of side to it, but was really destabilizing. It's not just to France, but beyond its borders as well. So it's all very well talking about this in abstracts, but it's got a very, very real impact on real people. So
very much so. I mean, I know of not sort of direct contacts, but I've got friends of friends who were caught up in the dreadful events at near Borough Market at London Bridge and that terrible attack. And, we barely talk about that anymore. But yeah, some horrific things happened. And, and it's, I have been to Borough Market often. And, all it takes is to be at the wrong place at the wrong time. And, before you know it, you're on the front line on the war on terror. So it's pretty horrific. But, so we'll go back to the Yazidis, because I think this is a very important topic. But thank you for your thoughts on what we just discussed there. But, so why did ISIS in particular target the Yazidis in the way that they did?
So yeah, it comes back to the Yazidis' religious faith and religious practice. So Yazidism, as it's called. I mean, this is fundamentally the entire reason that they were singled out for extermination. Really, obviously ISIS was unsuccessful in exterminating them ultimately, but large numbers of people lost their lives. So Yazidis practice a pre-Islamic faith. And this is one of the reasons I did an event with Tom Holland, the historian, who was very interested in this subject when when the research came out.
Yeah, I saw that.
This is how he got into it. Oh, thank you. No, yeah, he that was how he got interested in it, because he was kind of researching in the region the origins of Islam and how it kind of spread throughout the Middle East, and he came across this pre-Islamic faith, Yazidism. This kind of, they were worshipping a kind of peacock, prophet, angel, and he became kind of fascinated by them. He'd never heard of them before, and I think most people had never heard of them pre 2014, because it's such a small community. But unlike a kind of according to Islamic State ideology, you have what they call the people of the book, so Christians and Jews, who as much as ISIS despises Christians and Jews, technically under their caliphate, Christians and Jews are eligible to live under the protection, under their protection, as long as they pay a tax, the jizya. There are certain religious faiths that don't qualify for that. So the Yazidis were one of those faiths. So according to their kind of apocalyptic ideology, what would happen was, on Judgment Day, ISIS would be, not ISIS, the faithful, as they see themselves, the kind of community of believers, would be made to answer for the continued existence of pre-Islamic faiths. And this is another element to it. What happened wasn't a kind of spontaneous, uprising or an opportunistic attack. It was, they knew that they were about to come into contact with Yazidis because they were expanding their territory, and they set their legal and theological scholars to work to determine what would happen to the Yazidis once they conquered their territory. And they came to the conclusion that they were eligible to be taken as sabaya, so slaves or kind of spoils of war. So it was, I kind of put it like this: it was an attempt to destroy the Yazidi community, the Yazidi population, but it was also a kind of demolition of individual human beings as well. So the kind of destruction of the community happened on the level of executing all the men on the spot, or I think in some cases they gave people the opportunity to convert, but that was less common than just straight executing people. And then with the women, it was to take them as sex slaves, and the children to indoctrinate them and raise them, especially with the boys, it was to raise them as cubs of the caliphate, so the next generation of Islamic State soldiers. So really, you just, it's treating the women that they captured on a level that completely demolished their individuality and defiled them as human beings. And basically, there's one of the most chilling testimonials I came across from a Yazidi for survival was she said there was nothing left to do to me. And I don't know why, like compared to the kind of more graphic descriptions, that really stood out to me. It's just like how much can you just destroy a human, like an individual human being, and other elements as well. There was a woman who describes when they were raping her daughter that her daughter just went silent, as though she was just kind of just unconscious, but she was conscious and was aware of what was happening. And I just thought, you've just so utterly degraded and defiled and defeated a fellow human being to get to that point. So there's that on the individual level, but there's, like I said, it was an attempt to ensure that Yazidis didn't survive that attack and that onslaught. So that's why it qualifies as a genocide as well, because it wasn't an attempt to wipe them out. And again, to come back to what I referenced a moment ago, one of the interesting and kind of grisly differences here is, with like the Soviet system, like the Gulag Archipelago and things, that like the Soviets didn't really want people to know about that kind of stuff. And, other attempts at genocide and ethnic cleansing have kind of been made to obscure them, at least from the outside world. Whereas ISIS was quite happy to admit this was, part and parcel of their ideology. And in fact, they would be doing this to other communities that came under their territory as well. So, some of the best evidence we have of what happened is in ISIS's own propaganda, or from, straight from the horse's mouth of their own recruits. So, they were proud and boasted about this and knew exactly what they were doing and pre-planned it all.
Yeah. Well, with regards to the foreign fighters who joined ISIS, Can you give us an idea of the numbers who joined, where they were from, and if there are any commonalities among them in regards to motivation, psychological factors, sociological factors, any commonalities you can think of, if there were any?
Yeah, so I think it was. I mean, we're talking low end estimates here. I think in a lot of cases, but I think about over 40,000 people. I mean, at least are thought to have joined ISIS from all over the world. You're probably looking at 5,000 to 6,000 from Western Europe, at least, I would say. Again, some of the estimates are higher than that. And then, a few hundred more from North America, from the US, Canada, from Australasia, and from the Caribbean as well. So a couple of hundred went from Trinidad, and, a handful of others from other Caribbean islands. So if we take that, North America, Western Europe, the kind of Caribbean democracies, and Australasia to mean the West, you probably, I mean, it's really difficult to say because we don't know exactly how many went from some of those countries, but you're probably looking at least 6,000 minimum. Again, minimum. I just want to underline that based on the estimates. And I mean, one of the things I'm a bit of a broken record on this, and I'm happy to continue being a broken record because I don't think we've really fronted up to how this happened and how that many people were attracted to this group, or how they radicalized, in inverted commas. It's very much a territorial and geographical phenomenon that we've missed and underestimated. And I think one of the reasons we underestimated that was because we looked at ISIS propaganda, which was no doubt impressive compared to some of the kind of poor amateurish efforts that came before it. But we kind of made that the explanatory factor for why this was happening. And I just don't accept that. I don't accept that 40,000 people from around the world, or 6,000 people from Western democracies joined because they were kind of hypnotized by online propaganda. I just don't think that's a satisfactory explanation. And also it downplays the agency of the people who did this, and that downplays their kind of personal responsibility in the crimes that we're talking about.
What do you think did motivate those people if it wasn't the propaganda?
Well, motivations and kind of explanatory factors is slightly different, but it's very difficult to know what was going on in somebody's head, and especially even if you ask them, people apply justifications retrospectively that they think sound good or will help their case. So it's very difficult on that respect. But there is, like I said, there's a geographical element to this. So like 75 to 80%, like over 3/4 of the people who joined from those West, the West broadly conceived, came from just a handful of countries. So you're looking at France, Belgium, the United Kingdom, Germany, Scandinavia, these places. So and then if you drill it down even more than that, like into the individual countries, so look at France is a great example, because France has made much more in terms of their academics and the government has made much more of an effort to understand why this happened than any other country, because they were one of the worst affected, and certainly the worst affected by terror attacks. And what they found is that some neighborhoods were really badly affected by the phenomenon. The famous example is Trappes, which is about 25 kilometers from Paris, a kind of commune. And then there's Lunel in the southwest, which was a tiny kind of affluent, middle-class town, which became the capital of French jihad, in inverted commas. And then cities like Toulouse and Nice, which were really, really affected by the foreign fighter phenomenon. But then the curveball is that you have a city like Marseille, which is twice the size of Toulouse or Nice, which is relatively unaffected by the phenomenon, but it has all the socioeconomic conditions that you would want. It has crime, it has poverty, it has the infamous banlieue that we talk about, the projects for an American audience, and it has a large Muslim population as well, which kind of this kind of a liberal consensus and a right and far right consensus on this. The liberal consensus is this is online or because of structural socioeconomic factors, and the far right would have you believe this is all about Islam and Muslims, but the case of Toulouse, Nice, and Marseille kind of throws a different light on that, because Marseille has a large Muslim population, it has internet connection, obviously, and it has socioeconomic conditions, but it was not affected in the same way. Whereas, from Toulouse and Nice, you had dozens of people go. From Marseille, I think there were, a handful, one or two who traveled to Syria. So fundamentally, both of the kind of consensus explanations aren't really right on this. And what you're looking at, the commonalities or the common factor, is we're looking at ground that was prepared over the course of decades. So in Toulouse and Nice, you had recruitment networks set up in the early 2000s that started as 3 or 4 people, and then a decade later were 300 or 400 people in these kind of Salafi jihadi networks. So it really matters about on the ground physical spaces, physical networks, and social connections. But it's not just that as well. You need in a lot of these cases, you have the ground kind of ideologically prepared by other Islamist groups as well. So the kind of more militant Salafi groups operate in these areas, and in France and Belgium particularly have kind of Muslim Brotherhood linked organizations operating on the ground, doing dawa, as they call it, proselytization. So you need an awful lot of a lot of factors to intersect to have the foreign fighter phenomenon. It's not just one or the other or one simple explanation, and I think that's what we've got wrong.
I think that's a very important point, because I think we all are looking just for a magical single explanation, but there's so many factors that lead to these things with all forms of terrorism. There's never one singular thing.
Exactly, and it's one of the frustrating things has been like there's a phrase called normative sociology where we study what the cause of something ought to be rather than what it is. So we kind of have this debate which people want to ascribe the foreign fighter or the terrorist phenomenon to whatever thing it is that they're opposed to anyway. So, on the liberal left, you'll have people saying, it's all about, structural and socioeconomic causes. It's all about alienation and Islamophobia and discrimination and racism. Further left, you'll have people saying it's all foreign policy. And then kind of reaches of the right and far right, you'll have, it's all Muslims and Islam and foreigners and immigration. None of those explanations is satisfactory, and they also happen to be the things that those people didn't like before terrorism was a thing. So I think we need to be a bit more serious and a little less politically blinded.
Yeah, no, definitely. Well, on that topic of that, obviously there's been a lot of debate about ISIS returnees, and Islamic State's Western recruits have sought to sort of minimise the severity of their actions, and they've positioned themselves more as sinned against than in sin. So what have you learnt from studying the words of foreign fighters who have been caught in comparison to what they were saying at the height of their power?
Oh, there's been there's been nothing approaching repentance or individual responsibility from maybe from a handful, but you kind of have two main narratives. I mean, it's almost like a joke now that people say they were a cook or an engineer. They never fought and they never did anything. It's kind of, that's the kind of new version of I was just following orders, I guess.
Yeah, there was a lot of catering going on in Syria.
Exactly. Yeah, the food must have been fantastic in the caliphate. But then the other element to it is people now have heard this. They've heard our discourse at home, which is that this is groomers online and vulnerable people and stuff like that, and they're kind of repeating that back to us. So Tuba Gondal is a very good example of that. I don't know where she is in the world right now, but she was stranded in northern Syria. I heard that she'd got out via Turkey and possibly was on her way back to France, but I can't remember where she last was. But she was on social media at the time. She was all over. She was celebrating the Paris attacks. She was celebrating Jihadi John Mohammed Emwazi's attack, his execution videos, and then a few years later, she's saying that, I didn't know what I was doing. I was manipulated. I was brainwashed, and she's far from the only one who said that. A lot of them are saying that, and then there's even some people are trying to make it sound like a kind of a gap year gone wrong. Like there was a video that went viral a little while ago of a French jihadi woman who said, we some people go to India for a year and they don't like it. We went to the caliphate and we decided we made a mistake. And it's like totally detached from what they had done, I think. I reject that it's detached out of naivety. I think it's, detached out of a kind of latent ideological sympathies that it's just minimized the catastrophe and the violence of what they inflicted on the people who lived there. And that's, I think even if people did go and just kind of lived there and didn't get involved in any of the abuses and things like that, which I've got no doubt that happened as well, it's still not a victimless crime. It's still, at the very minimum, you have to ask, presumably you lived in a house, right? Whose house was that before ISIS came. You helped ISIS rule over the civilians in their territory with a total totalitarian form of governance. Public executions, public lashings, public amputations, and things like that. So, people were living in terror and fear and under a cruel regime. So it's not a victimless crime, and that's before we even get started on what happens to the Yazidis. So yeah, there's a huge mismatch between what people were saying in 2014 and 15 and now, and you have to ask, if ISIS was still going and still kind of all the triumphalism was still going, I don't think a lot of these people wouldn't have changed their tack at all, to be honest.
No. One of the things I've noticed, and I'm sure I'm not alone in noticing this, is that women ISIS members tend to be treated more as victims. Can you talk to us about what you learned about some of the actions of many female ISIS members?
Yeah, no, that's right. There is, especially with the women, there's... in fairness, there's quite an effort, and from women scholars as well who study counterterrorism, to say like there's this very condescending and what's the word, kind of paternalistic discourse surrounding female foreign fighters. So there is a bit of pushback on it, but I mean, the press kind of says that they're brides, which that's the press. I don't take too much issue with that because they're going to do that anyway. I don't think that's the core of the problem. But it does still suggest that they only went there to just get married and stuff like that, or they were kind of manipulated into going there. It's really significant that the only Westerners who have faced any kind of charges for what happens to the Yazidis are women, and all of them are in Germany. So the story you mentioned, right, to kick off this conversation about the 5-year-old girl who was killed and died of thirst. The first person charged for that was a woman in her 20s, a German woman. So the idea that women weren't complicit in this is just not accurate. And the other thing is, even I should have mentioned this before when we were talking about the foreign fighter inflow, but even the number of recruits, the spike in the number of recruits for ISIS came after their caliphate declaration. It wasn't like there's kind of this narrative that people were going to check out what it was all about, and then they got disillusioned and came home. But it was the resonance of the caliphate declaration was obviously impactful, because if you look at June, July, and August, that was when most foreign fighters came, and that was when large numbers of people joined after James Foley's beheading, after all their abuses and propaganda was all over front pages, and after what they'd done to the Yazidis. So, and a lot of those were women as well. So a lot of them joined fully in the knowledge that this was happening, even if they didn't participate in it when they got there. So I do think I'm not saying with all of these people the correct response is lock them up and throw away the key, but some sort of personal responsibility needs to be shown, and accountability needs to at least be demonstrated, and you're just not seeing that. You're seeing, like I said, the manipulation stories, or I was a cook, I was an engineer, or just people. But one of the most farcical things is people saying, I want to come back and help to prevent radicalization. Like sorry, bullshit. No, like you pay for your crimes first, and then we'll talk. You can't just reposition yourself as this expert on this now. It's just a bit. I think we're just not showing enough scrutiny, I think, of what's happening, and with the women especially now. Sorry, this is a bit of a long-winded answer, but with the women now, we're seeing what I call celebritization. So I really don't want to get into too much of Shamima Begum's case, because I think in some ways she's a distraction, because she, with so many people joined, and all of it gets focused on this one young woman. But with her, you see a bit of a celebritization, and every now and then a photo comes out of the camps, in like Al Hol camp, of Western women in looking like they're kind of doing an ASOS modeling shoot or something, and you look like they're having the time of their lives. And in the Netherlands, there's a woman who's a woman returnee who's had a book written, she's had a play put on about her. So we think the celebritization of Shamima Begum is bad. Like, it's even worse in some places. So it's just morally unserious, in my view, to kind of put, these aren't like pop stars who had a a period with drugs and they've kind of rebounded and stuff like that. I don't want to see these people on the kind of Good Morning Britain sofa.
No, I'm sure many of their victims don't either. So it's
exactly. Exactly.
Yeah. Well, we briefly sort of touched upon this earlier. I mean, we've seen these sort of very polarized debates online about ISIS returnees. And have you seen any sort of groups or organizations who are purposefully trying to polarize and muddy the waters on this topic? And to what end are they doing it?
Yes, but I think the problem is more mainstream as well. The bigger problem is mainstream. And I think, to come back to the celebritization thing, I understand there are some kind of NGOs and journalists that clearly want people like Begum, not just Begum, but some of the foreign fighters who are stranded there to come home. And I totally understand that. The people, and it's their every right to advocate for repatriation. But I think in their efforts to advocate for repatriation and kind of remodel these people as repentant or well, like I said, I haven't really seen much evidence that they are repentant, but remodel them as repentant or changed, or put them in Western clothing and stuff. I think that's making it worse, and that is polarizing it more because people are kind of digging their heels in a little bit when they see that, and it's really getting up people's noses. And one of the reasons for that, and I'm being a hypocrite because I'm going to talk about Begum, but one of the reasons that Begum herself is so polarizing is because she's almost like an avatar that we can project all of our. Both sides can project their positions on the whole phenomenon onto. So there's not, and there's a lot of anger there. There's a lot of this is so unresolved still. And like you said, we've kind of moved on from a lot of the attacks that happened, and in Britain we've almost completely moved on from the catastrophe of about 1,000 of our citizens joining ISIS. And there's no Salman Abedi, the Manchester bomber. There's no Salman Abedi left to be angry at. He blew himself up. We don't know the names and the faces of the other foreign fighters. So a lot of people, there's a lot of anger around the ISIS episode, which is unresolved, and a lot of that gets projected onto the Shamima Begum issue. So people are cynical, and I don't mean that in a pejorative way, but people are cynical and they're angry, and they don't want these people who joined this group, which we all remember what they did. They don't want them to be plastered on the front page trying to look all kind of Western and happy and stuff like that. It's just kind of a lot of our citizens were killed by the group that these people joined, and I just think and that's our citizens. And like you said, it's kind of when you start to talk about Yazidis or Syrians and Iraqis who were suffered under this group, it's kind of spitting on the graves of those people. So I think we just need to be a bit more serious. Really.
No, I
don't know how else to put it.
Yeah, no, I agree. Well, look, one question I've always had is, what is the kind of legal situation today with regards to foreign fighters returning to their home countries? Are many actually being investigated and charged, or is it a case people are kind of literally getting away with war crimes?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's hard to say. So my research can't. It doesn't make any judgment about like individual people. It doesn't bring any allegations against individuals and say this person should be charged. It just kind of says that there's no way that only 4 German women were involved in these crimes. Like this is, I'm talking about the cases that have made it to court in Germany. There's no way it's only that many. Like this is a much bigger problem that hasn't been dealt with yet. So it's just a kind of plea to A, not forget this, and B, investigate if we can. I don't know what's going on, with security services and police investigations. I haven't seen much evidence that there's a concerted effort to investigate whether these people committed, they're called international crimes or atrocity crimes. I've heard from some of the Yazidi organizations on the ground that there's not a huge amount of engagement from Western governments, particularly with their documentation efforts. So I think one of the things that could be done better is having a better link. For example, in the UK, our police has a war crimes unit. There could be better links between war crimes units and counterterrorism operations, and a lot more sharing of information. That's one of the things I've heard from Yazidi advocates. In terms of what's happening now, I mean, we know that a lot of these people are stranded, and Western governments are preferring not to deal with it or confront that. And to an extent, I understand that then they don't want to confront that or deal with that because the chances of prosecution are so low that if they did repatriate all these people, chances are that the overwhelming majority would go free and walk the streets.
Yeah, I've wondered that myself. And is there a particular? Well, it sounds silly, but I'm here to ask the silly questions. What is it that makes it so hard from a legal point of view to potentially prosecute these people? What is the, should we say, the challenge the government or the police and security services have, do you think?
Yeah. Again, I'm on shaky terrain because I'm no legal expert by any means. But no, I think it's very, very difficult to prove crimes have been committed in a foreign conflict zone, first of all. That's immensely difficult to prove. But I mean, even from the UK's perspective, I think one thing I'm keen to hammer home is that we've had 30 odd years of people joining Islamist or jihadi conflicts overseas, from like Bosnia to Chechnya, Somalia, Afghanistan, people going and fighting with jihadis. And even despite decades of it, we haven't really put the laws into place to deal with that phenomenon adequately. And obviously we're seeing the results of that now with the amount of people who have gone free or are stranded in northern Syria now. So, I mean, the worst reflection for me was with the Beatles, with Alexander Cotti and El Shafi El Sheikh, because the Crown Prosecution Service, and this is, people can look this up, this is online, Crown Prosecution Service basically determined that there was no way we could have confidence that we'd be able to secure a conviction if they came back to Britain, which is just shocking when you think about it. Like, these are two of the most notorious people who joined ISIS from our country. There are tons of witness statements about their treatment of captives and hostages. There's probably more evidence of their involvement in in like abuses and criminality and terrorist activity than anyone else. Yet what we've had to do is offload them to the Americans, which is a brilliant solution given the circumstances. That's the best thing that could have happened, because the Americans are going to be able to make sure that they face justice. But can you imagine if they'd come home and just gone free? It would have been appalling.
It's shocking. Yeah. I'm just amazed. I think you said it about, like, why haven't we updated our laws? What's going on? It's not like this has happened just suddenly.
Yeah.
We make an assumption sometimes that the authorities are more on it than they should be, more on it than they actually are, sorry. So do you remember the Gatwick drone incident?
Yeah.
Do you remember? Now, most people, I think, would assume that there would be sort of procedures in place for a rogue drone at an airport, and then that episode kind of just showed that there were no procedures, there was no thinking, there was no strategy about how to deal with a rogue drone at an airport, which is actually a very dangerous thing. And I kind of feel like that's sort of a bit like the government and ISIS returnees at the moment.
Yeah, no, I think so. And certainly over the year, like, I think there's around 450 have already come back, and only about 40 of those have I think have been convicted. Not all of them for offences relating to ISIS, by the way. Some of it criminality or terror offences when they came home. But yeah, and it took us by surprise, and it shouldn't have really. And even down to not just to the foreign fighters. Like, one of the things that happens every time a new conflict involving Muslims basically happens, we have charities which are kind of Islamist front groups go and they say they're raising money for charity and for humanitarian aid, but what they're doing is raising money for their preferred armed group. And again, this is not always jihadi groups. Like, in a lot of cases, this is the more kind of Muslim Brotherhood type influenced organizations that fight in these conflicts. And that happened with Syria in the early days. We had charity convoys going to Syria and raising money for different actors in the conflict. And we couldn't get to grips with that. And that's one of the reasons that William Shawcross is getting such a hiding from certain quarters now, is that he made a real effort when he was at the Charity Commission to put a stop to that. But obviously that gets respun as this guy targeted Muslim charities. Well, no, he was targeting weapons and fighters being funneled to conflict zones. So yeah, and I think you mentioned before that we're moving on from these things, and I think we're making the same mistake again by not really attempting to understand the ISIS phenomenon, and why so many of our citizens were attracted to that cause and that group. We're just asking for it to happen again, and I don't really see a reason that it won't happen again. Maybe not to the same scale, but all you need is another conflict to open up, another jihadist group. I mean, look at who knows what's happening in Central Africa and Mozambique right now. It's not as easy to get to as Syria, and possibly not as glamorous a location, but certainly that kind of thing can open up and become another beacon for foreign fighters. So yeah, I don't see any reason it won't happen again, but we're going to be unprepared for it again, sadly.
Yeah. What do Yazidi survivors think about the legal response in the West to ISIS returnees? Do they have confidence that there will be justice?
So from the survivor testimony that I was able to collect through Yazda, which is one of the Yazidi NGOs, there's a lot of pessimism among the survivors there. And this is the thing, they know about the debates that are happening in Western countries. They know that only a few people have made it to court in Germany. They don't always know all the details, but they're vaguely aware of what's happening, and they're very pessimistic and insulted as well. And not just the survivors, but like the Yazidi groups that operate in the West as well are just, you can imagine when they see one of these people who joined this organization, which was so brutal towards them, kind of being positioned as a victim themselves in our discourse and public debate. It's incredibly difficult for them to see that for obvious reasons. So yeah, they know vaguely what's going on. Again, one of the things they said was there's not a great deal of communication from Western governments. So, I mean, but that gets to the whole. I know Western governments need to be responsible for their own citizens first and foremost, but just in general, there's a whole kind of parochial approach to this issue, where we're only looking at foreign fighters through the lens of whether they're a security threat to us or a terror threat to us, and not really dealing with the kind of moral and legal reckoning that needs to come out of what happened. The whole foreign fighter debate is just about those individuals, and again, we're veering towards them becoming celebritized, and their victims in Iraq and Syria are completely erased from that debate and conversation. So for every kind of fawning piece over a foreign fighter who's stranded, or a recruit, I should say, not necessarily a fighter, it would be nice if we heard more from the Yazidis who are stuck in camps in Iraq as well, because they are living in wretched conditions in Iraq most of the time. A lot of them have not been able to return home to Sinjar. And actually, as we've seen with pretty much every genocide of the 20th century, one of the things we saw was neighbors turning on neighbors. So Yazidis feel immense distrust towards the local kind of tribes and families that live around the region. And that prevents them from returning home, because in a lot of cases, those people joined with or allied with ISIS or just let the assault happen. So there's immense trauma in the Yazidi community that is, it's just, I don't think the Yazidis will recover for a lifetime, at least. I mean, certainly the people who live through this are never going to get over it. I mean, their lives are just unthinkably damaged. And it's just not really something we're willing to talk about. And it's not just about the nature of who, the conversations around ISIS and the kind of awkward silence around Islamist extremism. I mean, genocide is not an easy thing to talk about. It's not an easy thing for us to understand or get to grips with. So there's a lot of reasons for that.
Yeah, definitely. How has your report been received? And have you had any sort of government or media interest in it?
So yeah, I was really pleasantly surprised by the response. Actually, I'm not, I'm by no means like a big name. So maybe if I was very fortunate to get Tom Holland involved in this, which helped it reach a much wider audience. Lord Walney as well, who's former Labour MP John Woodcock, who's been appointed as independent government advisor on political violence. He was a big supporter of this from the start. He's got a brief foreword in the report as well. So yeah, I think a bit more government engagement would be great. But having said that, there wasn't in the report, as you've read it, there wasn't a huge amount of kind of, tangible recommendations for governments to take forward. It was more just about building a picture. But yeah, the response has been great. I mean, people like yourself, I'm immensely grateful for your interest in this and to helping get it in front of a wider audience. So I think it's just a battle of attrition for me, really, is to keep, don't just let that be one report that came out and then we never come back to it. It's just to keep that in the conversation and keep talking about it and writing about it. And I'm working on the next phase of the research now, which I'm hoping will be like a long-term project to keep trying to get more information and more research into the public domain on this subject. So yeah, I mean, if there's anyone who's listening in who wants to reach out or help or has any ideas, like, I'm always happy to talk and want to hear those ideas. So yeah,
that's good. Is there anything listeners can actually do to help the Yazidis get justice?
Justice is difficult. There's plenty we can do to support Yazidis. So there's a bunch of Yazidi organizations. Like Yazda was the one that I worked with on this piece of research. One of the more prominent ones, which has Amal Clooney, the leading human rights barrister, involved with them. There's an organization called Nadia's Initiative as well, which is the Nobel Prize winner Nadia Murad-Bas. She founded that organization, is involved with them. There's a really small NGO called Yazidi Emergency Support, which is pretty much a one-woman setup for a lovely lady called Anne, who was immensely helpful to me in helping to raise awareness and connect with the right people when this report came out. So I couldn't recommend people supporting her enough, because she was just one person with, she's not Yazidi or anything like that. She's just, just works in health, and just was so moved by what happened that she decided she wanted to help. And, the small NGOs need the help as well. So I think supporting those organizations will be a great start. Look, simple things, I know it's a boring answer, but simple things like writing to MPs never hurts. This sounds like a massive ask, but if you want to write to an MP and send the paper as well, these things help. But yeah, it is a battle of attrition. So the more we can keep all of us making noise about it, the better, I think.
No, fantastic. Well, is there anything else you'd like to add before we wrap up today? Do you have any final thoughts or anything?
Nothing profound, but no. I mean, look, I think away from the Yazidi, what happens to the Yazidi, which is terrible. I mean, I would love it if people who listen to this read the report. I think you can sit down, grab a coffee or a tea, and read it cover to cover in about an hour. It's not. I'm not going to pretend it's a nice or an easy read. It's not. But I think it's I would say this because I'm biased because I wrote it, but I think it's important to read that. But away from that, I think there's a lot we can do to have a bit more of a serious conversation about jihadism in the West, in Britain in particular. There's a lot more to do, and I think there's this perception that maybe because there's not the same amount of funding or interest on the ISIS phenomenon or like jihadism, I think we kind of think that's gone away. We're looking for the next threat, or we're looking for the new and exciting things. And I think we need more historical work to understanding what happened there. And I don't think we should forget it just because that's not where the funding is, or it's not the fashionable thing to talk about. I think, if you look at the 7/7 bombings, right? That was 2005. The next fatal attack we saw in the UK was the Lee Rigby murder, which was 8 years later. So this has a long horizon. We're talking about a long time frame and a long life of jihad in the West, basically. And I don't see any evidence that it's gone away. I think there's every chance that the problems of jihadism are actually more ahead of us than behind us. Simply because of the numbers that have been involved previously. And that's not to make a prediction, because we don't know what's going to happen. Things could change. But there's just no reason that more won't happen. So I think we need to be prepared for that, and stop the insane and debates that have happened around this stuff before. And I think one thing we can all do is stop it just being swallowed by the culture war. Stop it becoming a kind of polarizing issue where we just adopt the opposite position to what our kind of tribal political opponents think. This is too important for it to become a culture war issue. But I'm not optimistic about that because even COVID became a cultural war issue to an extent. So sorry, I'm very pessimistic. That's my final thought.
Yeah, no, fair enough. I could understand it. But yes. But anyway, well, look, Liam, thank you so much for joining me today. Where can listeners sort of find out more about you and your work?
Sure, yeah. So just keep an eye on Counter Extremism Project website. Like if I do new research, it'll go on there. I write quite frequently for Unheard as well on terrorism, extremism, political violence, broadly conceived. Occasionally for The Spectator, on Twitter as well. Liam SD12, I think, is my username. So yeah, you might regret following me, but if you want to, that more than welcome to. But no, just above all, like, thanks so much for having me on. And I think just, the reason that I've been pleasantly surprised by the response to the report is, opportunities like this to speak about it. So it needs people to be passionate and interested about the subject as well. So I'm tremendously grateful. So thank you.
My pleasure. Well, thank you for joining me today. It's been great.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. This is Secrets and Spies.